In June 1985, a student disappeared from a national university in northern Iwate Prefecture. His name was Saito Kazuya, and he was 21 years old at the time. He lived in the university's third dormitory. According to university records, Kazuya was on duty at the dormitory telephone exchange that night from 9 p.m. until 7 a.m. the next day. He was last seen around 2:45 a.m. Witnesses reported that the light in the duty room was still on, and they heard the phone ringing. The connection was lost shortly after 3 in the morning. The next morning at 7, when the duty officer entered the room, Kazuya was nowhere to be seen. The door was left open. On the table stood a cup of cold coffee, a notebook, and a cassette tape with the inscription, "Recording, June 17th." The telephone receiver was lying on the floor, the chair was slightly pushed back, and there were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Iwate Prefectural Police received the report at 7:26 a.m. Police and firefighters searched the dormitory and surrounding area for 2 days, but found no evidence. The investigation report simply stated that the disappearance was likely voluntary or suicide. No evidence was found to suggest foul play. The investigation was closed after 6 days. The file was transferred to the university archives as internal document number 458-A, and the family was told there was no useful information. Saito's mother, Fumiko, continued to send New Year's cards to the dormitory address for 30 years, but never received a reply. In 2017, the third dormitory had become so dilapidated that it was decided to demolish it. The demolition work was carried out under the university's supervision. On August 14th, workers discovered an old cardboard box containing dozens of tapes in an underground storage facility. One of the tapes had a label attached to it that read, "Recordings of telephone conversations in dormitory number 3, June 17, 1985. The university contacted the local police. When they turned on the recording, the first thing they heard was static. A few seconds later, a young man's voice rang out, "Hello? This is the student dorm. Who is this?" There was a brief silence followed by the sound of something like faint breathing, after which the sound died away and the tape automatically rewound. Analysis of the recording revealed that the audio recording was being made using the dormitory's communication system at the time, and that there was no connection to an outside line. In other words, the call Kazuya received wasn't from an outside source, but from a line within the dorm. The source has not been identified. The discovery was reported on the local news and attracted public attention as a missing man's voice is heard after 30 years. However, the police didn't reinvestigate the case, and it was quietly forgotten again. However, one reporter became interested in the recording. Yumi Kondo, a freelance journalist from Tokyo and a former graduate of the same university, vividly remembered the dimly lit corridors and quiet nights of her student years in dormitory number 3. When Yumi Kondo arrived in Iwate, she visited the university's administrative department and requested permission to review documents from 1985. She was officially cleared to report the incident. All that remained in the storage room were a few photographs, a copy of the police report, and a bound copy of the investigation report on yellowed paper. The report noted that the third dormitory's telephone system did not have an external connection, but rather an internal line connecting the dormitory to the adjacent school building. The last entry in the logbook was in Saito's handwriting and read, "Contact confirmed at 2:46, no deviations." There were no other entries. When Yumi visited the former dormitory site, it was already a vacant lot. Only a single telephone pole remained among the weeds, and no trace remained of its former state. Former student Shinji Tanaka, who lives nearby, spoke to reporters and said he was living on the top floor of the same dormitory at the time of the incident. According to Tanaka, it was raining heavily on the night of the disappearance, and most of the students were in their rooms. He added that he didn't hear any screams or unusual noises. However, he said he remembers hearing a short bell in the middle of the night that rang only once and then died away. The next morning, when police inspected the scene, they temporarily restored the phone line and again heard a faint noise from the device, which should have been turned off. These statements were not included in the report, and the police regarded them as a technical malfunction and did not include them in their investigation. During the interview, Yumi noticed that some documents were missing from the report, in particular an appendix titled Audio Materials. According to a former university employee, police seized several audio cassettes immediately after the incident and never returned them. When checking the name of the police officer in charge, it turned out that the same name had appeared in other cases of student disappearances that had occurred in the same prefecture in the 1980s. Although there was no official connection between the cases, all the incidents occurred during the summer and involved university dormitories or research centers. Yumi visited Saito's mother, Fumiko, who lived in Morioka. The elderly woman gave a short interview and quietly shared her memories of those days. On the night of the incident, her son called her. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, he calmly said, "I'll be back soon. It's quiet in the dorm." He laughed into the receiver and added, "The phone rings by itself at night." Fumiko assumed he was joking and didn't ask any questions. After the incident, Fumiko came to the university every year to inquire about her son's whereabouts, but the answer was always the same: no new information. Among the letters was one dated 3 days before the incident. It read, "If the phone rings in the middle of the night, don't answer." Graphology experts noted that the letter was written in a calm handwriting and showed no signs of fear or confusion. According to prefectural police reports, telephone line problems were reported in several university dormitories in Iwate Prefecture in mid-June 1985. However, the cause was never determined. The university's technical report stated that the communication system in the third dormitory briefly stopped working at 3:10 a.m. This coincided with the time of the incident. The outage was attributed to a voltage surge in the internal wiring. Afterward, the dormitory's communications were down for several days. Yumi looked through the documents of the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, now the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, and found a record of testing of communications equipment, measuring signal delay. The test location was listed simply as Iwate Prefectural Educational Institutions. The name of the university was not mentioned. The testing was carried out by a private contractor, which had already been disbanded by that time. No records of the specialists who worked there remain. Yumi called one of those involved, former communications engineer Masayuki Ono. He simply replied, "I was measuring the delayed signal," without providing any further details. These words suggested that the university was involved in some kind of communications experiment, but no documents existed to confirm this. Further investigation revealed that the network may have been part of a national research project, but all public records had been deleted. Yumi was convinced the truth was out there. Her next goal was to find out where the technical director was at that moment. Continuing her research, Yumi came across the name Yoshio Murayama, an engineer who was in charge of the university's communications equipment in 1985. Murayama retired in 1991 and was later confirmed to be living alone in a suburb of Niigata Prefecture. Yumi went to Niigata to visit Murayama at home. According to neighbors, he rarely went outside and avoided contact with people. At first, Murayama refused to give an interview, but when he heard the name Saito Kazuya, his expression changed and he spoke more quietly. According to Murayama, in 1985, the university participated in an experiment commissioned by the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications to study the effects of communication delays. The experiment involved deliberately creating a signal delay on an internal line to measure the reaction speed of the person on the other end of the line. During the test, Murayama would occasionally hear an echo, and then, after a few seconds, his own voice would return. Around 3 o'clock in the morning on June 17th, the system suddenly lost synchronization, and the signal on the monitoring screen disappeared. Murayama attempted to reconnect from the remote terminal, but there was no response. After that, the communication log was interrupted. The next morning, he received a call informing him that a student was missing. He was immediately questioned by the police, but he only said it was due to technical problems. Murayama submitted the report to the university, but no copies survived, and the original was reportedly seized by police. 2 weeks later, he was summoned to the police and asked to remain silent. He was informed that the matter would be treated as an accident that occurred during the course of his research. Murayama subsequently suffered a nervous breakdown and retired. His testimony became the first public testimony since the incident. Returning to Tokyo, Yumi handed the audio recording over to an expert for analysis. He discovered that the recording contained 2 voices, superimposed on each other with a delay of approximately 1.5 seconds. Experts noted that it is very likely a self-echo caused by an internal loop line. In other words, it was entirely possible that Kazuya was hearing his own voice, returning with a slight delay. Typically, this phenomenon disappears after a few seconds, but on film it lasted for over 13 minutes. It was believed that the equipment of that time could not support such a long closed cycle. As a result of the analysis of the audio signal shape, a pattern was discovered. The signal periodically increased and decreased at equal intervals of time. Experts have pointed to the possibility of external electromagnetic influence, but no evidence of this has been preserved. At the time, there was an old radio relay tower on the dormitory grounds. Records mentioned that the communication lines sometimes became unstable due to lightning strikes. However, no signs of lightning damage were found, and the electrical system was functioning normally. There was no sign of fire, electrical shock, or that Kazuya had left the room. After the investigation, only one thing was confirmed. Communication was completely lost at 3:10 in the morning. Yumi began searching again for former students who had lived in the dorm at the time. Of the 87 people, she only managed to contact 24. 7 of them agreed to be interviewed, and all of them said that the lights suddenly went out several times that night. The power outage lasted about 3 minutes, and some witnesses claimed to hear the phone ring once immediately afterward. Another former student, Yuji Kato, reported that immediately after the incident, a notice appeared on the wall. Using a phone at night is prohibited. The order was believed to have been issued by the university, but no reason was given for its introduction. Yumi filed a formal request with the police asking for the information to be released, but the original documents were destroyed in 2005 and were lost. Only a few former employees had papers from that time, and their testimony became the only key to reconstructing the course of events. Yumi decided to reenact the experiment. She obtained a telephone and voice recorder of the same model used back then and recreated the setting as closely as possible to the original. As a result of the experiment, it was possible to reproduce a short-term echo, but its duration did not exceed 20 seconds. The 13-minute recording could not be played. One engineer suggested that someone might have intentionally looped the line, but no evidence was found to support this. According to internal police documents, some of the telephone lines were replaced after the incident. The reason given for the replacement was natural aging of the equipment, but the timing of the work appeared suspiciously early. Later, a former Iwate prefectural police officer contacted the editorial office anonymously and said, "The authorities ordered me to close this case as soon as possible." At the time, he said, if an accident occurred during university research projects, department policy prohibited releasing any information to the public. In other words, Saito's disappearance could be portrayed as a research error. Yumi was finally convinced that the incident was not caused by a simple disappearance of a person, but by an institutional cover-up of information. In search of further evidence, she contacted former employees of the Institute for Communications Research. One of them said he had seen a recording of the delayed communication experiment and remembered its content. The document was reported to read, "Data return signal detected, source unknown." This phrase coincided in time with Kazuya's disappearance. The laboratory's records were later destroyed, but a former employee who retained materials from that time provided a copy. It said, 3 hours 10 minutes past the morning, signal lost, synchronization broken. As soon as Yumi saw these words, she understood everything. At that very moment, Kazuya's voice disappeared, and with it, the system signal disappeared. She contacted the university again for an interview, but received only a short response. We cannot comment on this matter. With all doors remaining closed, Yumi's investigation gradually reached a dead end. But soon new information came in. Someone said they had seen him. 2 weeks after the interview, Yumi received an envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a short letter that read, "I saw him. He's not dead." The postmark was from Hachinohe, Aomori Prefecture, a port city located approximately 150 kilometers from the university. Yumi headed there immediately. The letter belonged to a 61-year-old former truck driver named Kenji Isobe, who said that around June 20th, 1985, he saw a young man at the bus station in Hachinohe. The man was described as thin, dark-haired, holding a plastic bag, restless, and constantly looking around. He stood at the payphone, held the receiver in his hand for a while, but still did not dial the number. When Isobe tried to call out to him, the man suddenly left the area and headed toward the harbor. He hasn't been seen since. He reported the incident to the police, but they refused to take it seriously, stating that the case had already been classified as suicide. Yumi checked the bus station's records, which showed that on June 20th, 1985, at 21:12 a.m., a call was made from a public telephone to a number in Morioka. The number belonged to the Sato family. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. The caller's identity was not established. Her mother, Fumiko, later testified that she received a strange, garbled phone call that night. She said, "Amidst the static, I briefly heard a voice say, 'Mom, it's me.'" The call immediately ended, and there was no further communication. This testimony suggested that Kazuya may have remained alive for several days after the incident. The prefectural police stated that they would not reopen the investigation due to the statute of limitations. Yumi decided to continue the investigation herself. Getting from the dorm to Hachinohe took about 4 hours of walking and train travel, which was possible even at night. The Hachinohe Bus Company's reports showed the name Saito written in pencil on the passenger list for June 20th. Although only a last name was listed, without a first name, the time and destination were the same. This couldn't be dismissed as a mere coincidence. When contacted by police, they reported that the accounting books from that period had been destroyed, and any connection to the incident had been officially denied. Yumi visited the old bus station in Hachinohe. The payphones were still there, but the equipment had been replaced. On the back of the phone there was still part of an old university sticker with the words Iwate University barely visible. Underneath it, the number 17 was carved with a sharp object. Yumi was deeply impressed by this number, which seemed to indicate a date. She also reviewed local hospital records, which mentioned that a man with amnesia was admitted in late June. He was about 170 centimeters tall, of slim build with black hair. From the description, he resembled Kazuya. The next day, the man disappeared from the hospital. Reports stated he had been transferred to another facility, but no recipient hospital was listed. Yumi strongly suspected that this man was Kazuya, but the doctor who was working at the time had already died, so it was impossible to confirm this. A few days after the incident, temporary student employment documents were discovered along the coast. The name Saito K was listed. His job was dismantling a decommissioned military communications facility. He worked there for just 1 day before disappearing. There were records that he had received a salary, but the signature was in block letters and did not match his handwriting. The object was located in an area close to a university research center where old equipment, presumably used for communications experiments, was stored. At the site of the object stood a rusty telephone terminal with a number engraved on it that began with the Tokyo area code 03. Experts suggested that it was most likely a communication line leading directly to a research center in Tokyo. However, the facility had already been closed, and all associated materials had been disposed of. Yumi published her first report in October 2017. The article caused a huge stir and was featured on national news. One after another, publications titled "Telephone Incident in Dormitory No. 3" began to appear on the internet. Some former students said, back then, the phones in the dorms would ring by themselves. Among the surviving photographs was a shot of the inside of a telephone panel where a cable labeled "external test line" was visible. The university did not disclose this line configuration, which indicated the possibility of an unknown communication route. Yumi showed the photo to a communications expert who suggested that an additional test line might have been included in the system. If this was indeed the case, then the scale of the experiment exceeded the university's authority. She filed a Freedom of Information Act request, but was told the documents did not exist and had all been destroyed. Continuing her research, Yumi met a former ministry official who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. He said, "In 1985, we were testing a new communication system in Iwate Prefecture. One of the collaborating institutions was a university. During the experiment, the slow reflection of the signal on the line continued abnormally long, and at the test site, it was reported that the voices were returning. The test was immediately terminated, the records were classified, and those involved were transferred to other departments." If these words are true, Saito's disappearance could have been an accident that occurred during the experiment. However, neither the police nor the university confirmed this. No official documents were found. As Yumi continued interviewing, more and more of those involved in those events chose to remain silent. Everyone said the same thing: "It's over." At the end of another interview, Yumi returned to the site of the former dormitory, where she noticed several pieces of old concrete under the snow. Where Dormitory 3 once stood, a rusty sign reading "telephone room" was half buried. She picked up the sign and calmly pointed the camera at it. At that moment, a fragment of an old cable appeared under the snow. Perhaps this was the part of the line that Kazuya touched for the last time. Returning to Tokyo, Yumi Kondo gathered all her previous materials and began editing a documentary program, the release of which was planned for the end of 2017. At the time, journalists contacted the Iwate Prefectural Police for comment, but received a terse response. Case 458-A has been closed due to the statute of limitations. A retrial is not planned. In January of the following year, Yumi received a package from an unknown sender. Inside were an old magnetic tape and a scrap of paper. The paper read, "This is the second recording. It is not included in the transcript." When an expert examined the tape, it turned out that the handwriting and date on the label completely matched the data on the first cassette. When I listened again, the same voice came over the speakers again. "The line won't disconnect. Someone's here," said a voice presumably belonging to Kazuya. After a few minutes, silence reigned. A steady, mechanical hum could be heard in the background, barely audible. The last words recorded on tape were, "If you find this, don't blame anyone." Then the recording ended. Experts analyzed the acoustic environment of the recording and concluded that it was likely made in an underground room. This conclusion was made due to the coincidence of the background noise frequency with the operation of the underground generator of the third dormitory. This meant that Kazuya could have been on the dorm grounds right up until the moment of his disappearance. Yumi handed the recording over to the police, but no further investigation was conducted because no new evidence of criminal activity was discovered. On February 4, 2018, a special program called "The Night the Dorm Went Silent" was broadcast. The program received a great public response, and many viewers responded after its release. Among them was an anonymous message from a former police officer. He reported that there was another tape that was deemed unrecoverable and excluded from the official report. According to him, the recording was kept in the police archives, but subsequently disappeared. It is highly likely that it was this second tape that later ended up in Yumi's possession. Following the broadcast, the university conducted an internal investigation but concluded there were no signs of foul play. No records of the old premises were preserved. Nevertheless, the program made a strong impression on viewers. It was called "The Night the Voice Returned" and won the award for Best Documentary. On the other hand, some university officials criticized the move, saying it was an unnecessary attention-grabbing effort. In 2018, a new school building was completed on campus. The site of the former third dormitory is now covered with grass, and nothing remains. Only one small metal plaque was installed in the corner of the flower bed. It bore the inscription, "Former Communications Room." The university did not explain who exactly installed this plaque. A year after the program aired, Yumi received another envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph. The photo showed a group of students photographed immediately before the incident. On the back it said, "He shouldn't be there." In the photo, Kazuya was the only one who looked a little blurry, while the rest of the students were captured clearly. The examination found no signs of editing and concluded that the blurriness occurred during filming. Yumi did not use the photo on air, but kept it in her personal archive. In her notebook she wrote, "Even if no one remembers, the recording still preserves the voice." 30 years have passed since the incident, and many of those involved have already passed away. However, a younger generation of journalists who watched the program became interested in the case again and began their own investigations. In 2020, a local newspaper published a special article entitled "Lost Communications Recordings." It cited internal university documents that said, "An unidentified signal was detected at 3:10 a.m. This data was discovered after the program was released and passed on to the police." However, no formal reinvestigation was ever launched. That same year, the opening ceremony of the new campus of Iwate University took place, but not a word was mentioned about this incident. Yumi, who was in the press box, stood up silently and looked at the place where the dormitory once stood. She heard a slight metallic sound mixed with the wind and closed her eyes for a moment. 3 years after completing the program, Yumi became seriously ill. Even during her recovery, she continued to receive inquiries about her case from all over the country. Each time she simply answered calmly, "Trust the records." In 2021, Kazuya's mother, Fumiko Saito, died. Yumi attended the funeral and placed the first cassette tape in her coffin. Perhaps this act was her way of giving account. A few months later, Yumi left journalism, and this investigation was the last of her career. That same year, Night Hostel was rescreened as a special feature at the NHK Documentary Awards. The public reaction was muted, but the program left a deep impression. At the end of the program, the presenter said, "Time goes by, but the voice does not stop." This was the only conclusion of this story. 40 years have passed since that incident. The phone in the third dorm is probably still ringing. 2025, exactly 40 years since Kazuya Saito's disappearance. Officially, he remains missing. Iwate University stated that all materials related to the incident have already been destroyed. The storage period expired in 2005, and there are no plans for a reinvestigation. The only remaining evidence is a tape stored in the television company's archive safe. Representatives of the television company commented, "We do not plan to re-release the film, as we have not received the family's consent." Saito's parents died, his father in the 1990s, his mother in 2021. He had no surviving relatives. A new campus was built on the site of the former dormitory, which students have been attending since 2019. In the corner of the new building, there is a small metal plaque with the inscription, "Former Communications Room of the Third Dormitory." According to Iwate Prefectural Police, more than 200 student disappearances were reported in the region between the 1970s and 1990s. Many of them remain unsolved, and for some it is impossible to determine whether they were connected to a crime. Kazuya Saito's case was considered one such case. Petitions to reopen the investigation were filed repeatedly, but all were rejected. The official explanation for this is a technical malfunction, but no expert has been able to explain the 13 minutes of recorded call. In March 2025, the TV channel again showed the documentary film Quiet Dormitory, filmed 7 years ago. After the broadcast, the program generated a huge response. Thousands of comments appeared on the official website. The main question, repeated again and again, was, "Why is no one looking for him?" A few days later, a group of student volunteers from Iwate University launched a small archival project called Voices from Dormitory Number 3. The students created an online archive, collecting all known materials on the case, and made it publicly accessible. In the first week, the site was visited by over 300,000 people. Former students and teachers also expressed their willingness to help, and a campaign began to collect signatures asking for a memorial plaque to be erected. In May 2025, the university installed a small bench on campus with a plaque that read, "In memory of our missing students." There were no names on the plaque, but everyone who knew the story understood who it was dedicated to. At the end of summer, a re-inspection of the communications equipment was conducted. Old copper wiring was discovered underground. Experts determined it was part of an internal communication line dating back to the 1980s. The insulation was marked Line 3. This was the only new discovery. Police commented, "It is unclear whether this is related to the incident." On windy days, local residents report hearing a faint metallic ringing sound. Engineers attribute it to resonance from ventilation shafts. The TV channel that re-aired the program broadcast the original recording without editing. At the end, the announcer said, "We're not looking for a criminal, we're looking for a voice." These words are remembered by many today. The program is used as a teaching resource in Japanese journalism schools, where students study it as a testament to silence. In 2025, Kazuya Saito's whereabouts remain unknown. He is listed as missing in action in the police database. His name remains in the margins of the archival footage, but his voice can still be heard on the tape. 40 years later, someone might still be waiting for an answer from inside that tape.